hier angesammelte Material der Reagan-Jahre arbeiten, um daraus wissenschaftliche Erkenntnisse oder zu ziehen, Bücher zu schreiben. Es gibt über 50 Millionen Seiten an Dokumentation hier. Es gibt viele Originalstücke, unter anderem jene Ecke eines Restaurants, in der Ronald Reagan damals um die Hand von Nancy Reagan anhielt. Also es ist schon ein interessanter Platz, der täglich von 500 bis 1000 Menschen besucht wird. Nun hat der Leichenwagen hier Halt gemacht und die Abordnungen der verschiedenen Waffengattungen werden nun dem Ex-Präsidenten sicherlich die letzte Ehre erweisen. Dann wird es in Kürze, hier sehen wir Sohn Ron Junior und Patty, dann wird es in Kürze zu einer privaten Feier, Gedenkstunde der Familie kommen. Wir warten noch auf Nancy Reagan, die im Auto noch momentan sitzt.
Roger, Ronald Reagan ist ja der erste ehemalige amerikanische Präsident seit 1973, der ein Staatsbegräbnis bekommt. In dieser langen Zeit ist nur ein weiterer ehemaliger Präsident gestorben, Richard Nixon, wegen des Watergate-Skandals kein Staatsbegräbnis. Für ihn vielleicht noch ein paar, während wir hier warten, auch auf Nancy Reagan und darauf, dass der Sarg mit den sterblichen Überresten Reagans herausgetragen wird. Die aktuellen Entwicklungen von heute, die Börse in New York hat bekannt gegeben, dass auch sie am Freitag geschlossen bleiben wird, dass dort kein Handel stattfinden wird, aus Respekt vor Reagan, der wie kaum ein anderer, so hieß es heute, für den freien Handel gestanden hätte. Am Freitag sind ja auch sämtliche Bundesbehörden der USA auf Anordnung von Präsident George W. Bush geschlossen. Am Freitag auch der Staatsakt in Washington. Zwischendrin, und das ist ganz bemerkenswert, Roger Ornay, wird der Leichnam Reagans mit einem Pferdewagen durch die Hauptstadt gefahren werden. Und das ähnelt sehr den Feierlichkeiten zum Tode John F. Kennedys 1963, nicht wahr?
Mit absoluter Sicherheit, und es unterstreicht, Sie haben es eben schon angesprochen, die Beliebtheit des Präsidenten. Wenn man heutzutage auf die Straße geht, und es ist vollkommen egal, ob man mit einem Demokraten oder einem Republikaner spricht, alle erinnern sich an die Reagan-Jahre und verbinden dies mit guten Zeiten hier in den USA, mit wirtschaftlichem Aufschwung, mit politischen Erfolgen hin zu Russland, zu Osteuropa, aber auch zur Öffnung Chinas. Es gab natürlich auch tragische Momente, der Iran-Kontra-Konflikt, der tragische Absturz Challengers, der Raumrakete, all dies kennzeichnete die Reagan-Jahre. Aber wen auch immer man anspricht vom offiziellen Washington, alle erinnern sich auch an den Humor des Präsidenten. Man muss ja sich auch vor Augen führen, hier sehen wir Familienangehörige, dass er nur 70 Tage im Amt beinahe bei einem Attentat ums Leben gekommen wäre. Als man ihn damals ins Krankenhaus brachte, waren seine ersten Worte an die behandelnden Ärzte: Sind Sie denn auch alle Republikaner? Dies unterstreicht eigentlich, in welchem Sinne, in welcher Art und Weise Ronald Reagan gelebt hat. Er hat immer auch einen Bezug zum einfachen Bürger gefunden. Er ging auf den Bürger zu, er sprach mit ihm und war von daher für die Bürger der USA ein offener Präsident.
Hier also der mit der amerikanischen Flagge mit den Stars and Stripes bedeckte Sarg des ehemaligen Präsidenten. Sie sagten es eben, Roger Ornay, Soldaten sämtlicher Waffengattungen, das sind ja 5 in den USA, tragen diesen Sarg. Wir haben das Heer, die Luftwaffe, die Marineinfanterie und auch die Nationalgarde. Und hier ein erstes Bild von Nancy Reagan. Anfang 80 ist sie, nur 10 Jahre jünger als ihr Mann. Und wir machen eine kurze Pause für den militärischen Salut.
Face. Casket. Up. 2 more left. Stop.
Der Leichnam Ronald Reagans wird also aufgebahrt in dieser Bibliothek in Simi Valley, nicht weit von Los Angeles entfernt, wo er für 2 Tage bleiben wird, sodass Freunde, Familie, Anhänger seiner Politik, die sich ihm und seiner Person verbunden fühlen, Abschied nehmen können. Roger Ornay, das mag einige unserer Zuschauer vielleicht ein klein wenig verwundert oder verwirrt haben. Die Musik, die wir gerade eben gehört haben, während wir hier Nancy Reagan sehr gefasst sehen, das war die Melodie auch der britischen Nationalhymne. Wie kommt es, dass die bei dieser Gelegenheit gespielt wurde?
Um ehrlich zu sein, keine Ahnung. In diesem Zusammenhang ist es natürlich so gewesen, dass man hier sicherlich zurückgegangen ist auf die geschichtlichen Ursprünge und von daher diese Melodie gewählt hat. Auf der anderen Seite ist es so, dass dies hier ein Zeremoniell ist, wo sehr viel das Familiäre hineinspielt. Und ich bin ehrlich gesagt überfragt, warum diese Melodie hier gewählt wurde.
Vielleicht noch ein paar Worte zur Familie Ronald Reagans, gerade auch zur Ehe mit Nancy Reagan, die ja über ein halbes Jahrhundert lang hielt, weil das, was jetzt gleich im Anschluss stattfinden wird, ja eine private, eine Familienfeier sein wird. Erzählen Sie doch vielleicht ein bisschen gerade über diese ja auch politisch nicht unbedeutende Verbindung dieser beiden.
In der Tat, Nancy Reagan war eine Figur, der man immer zuschrieb, sie sei die beste Beraterin des Präsidenten gewesen während seiner Amtszeit. Und sie war eine sehr energische Frau, die aber auch genau wusste, wo sie sich in einem politischen Washington im Hintergrund halten musste, trotz alledem ihre Rolle erfüllte als Beraterin dieses Präsidenten. Auf der anderen Seite muss man auch die letzten 10 Jahre des Lebens von Ronald Reagan noch einmal Revue passieren lassen. Als er von der grauenvollen Alzheimer-Krankheit befallen wurde, nahm sie dies als tragischen Schicksalsschlag hin und engagierte sich vor allen Dingen auch im Gegensatz beispielsweise zu Präsident George W. Bush für die Stammzellenforschung, machte deutlich, dass die Wissenschaft hier Möglichkeiten habe, die es zu nutzen gelte, um eben Krankheiten wie Alzheimer, Parkinsons, Diabetes etc. Wirksam bekämpfen zu können. Und man muss immer wieder unterstreichen, wir sehen dies auch hier in den letzten Minuten, wie tapfer sie doch das schwere Schicksal der Familie getragen hat. Hier Sohn Ron und die Tochter Patty. Es gibt noch einen weiteren Sohn, Michael. Eine Tochter, Maureen, ist vor 3 Jahren an Krebs verstorben. Also von daher Schicksale, die die Familie doch hart getroffen haben.
Roger, während unsere Live-Übertragung sich langsam ihrem Ende nähert, vielleicht noch eine Frage nach der zentralen Trauerfeier, die Ende der Woche in Washington stattfinden wird. Hier in Deutschland haben wir heute Abend erfahren, dass auch Bundeskanzler Schröder daran teilnehmen wird im Anschluss an den G8-Gipfel. Wer der internationalen Größen und Staatsmänner wird denn noch am Freitag in Washington sein bei dieser zentralen Kundgebung?
Also heute wurde kolportiert, das muss noch bestätigt werden, dass vom G8-Gipfel die Führer der dort vertretenen Nationen hier nach Washington reisen werden, um an dieser Feier teilzunehmen. Natürlich werden alle früheren US-Präsidenten, darunter Bill Clinton, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, George Bush Senior, an dieser Feier teilnehmen. Es wird erwartet, dass Michail Gorbatschow, wir haben ja auf das Verhältnis Reagan-Gorbatschow hingewiesen, das die politische Öffnung hin zu Osteuropa möglich machte. Er wird anwesend sein. Man erwartet eigentlich auch, dass Helmut Kohl anreisen wird. Der frühere Bundeskanzler, der ja nun auch eine enge Beziehung politischer Art hin zu Ronald Reagan hatte. Also von daher werden wir hier über 100 Regierungschefs, Staatschefs sicherlich in der Kathedrale erleben. Und wir haben schon heute Sicherheitsstufe 1, denn der Secret Service hat natürlich zwei Aufgaben zu bewältigen. Zum einen die Sicherheit der G8-Führer, ungefähr 2 Flugstunden entfernt von Washington und unmittelbar danach dann hier auch schon während der Feiern im Kapitol die Sicherheit der nationalen Führer und der internationalen Staatschefs, die dann nach Washington kommen.
Vielen Dank für den Moment, Roger Orné. Und wir werden uns jetzt auch gleich ausblenden aus dieser Live-Berichterstattung, denn in wenigen Augenblicken wird ein privater Gottesdienst stattfinden für die Familie und die engsten Freunde Ronald Reagans. Noch einmal, sein Sarg ist angekommen in Simi Valley in der Bibliothek, die nach ihm benannt ist, wo der Leichnam 2 Tage lang aufgebahrt sein wird. So viel zu diesem Thema.
They've come from California and across the country to queue for up to 5 hours in order to say a personal farewell. The coffin of America's 40th president lies in the lobby of his own library, and many are simply unable to contain their grief. It's here in California that Ronald Reagan launched both his professional and political careers. And amongst the first to pay his respects was Arnold Schwarzenegger, who as actor and now governor is following in Mr. Reagan's footsteps. They've been filing through at the rate of 2,000 an hour throughout the night. So many people want to pay their respects. There's now talk of extending the hours of public viewing. To these people, Ronald Reagan was one of America's greatest presidents.
I think he was like the finest patriot in America. And I'm very patriotic, so he was really a great president.
It's a loss, and yet I know where he is now, and he's in a much better place.
This intense period of public mourning began with an intimate moment shared by the world. After a brief service beside her husband's coffin, Nancy Reagan said goodbye. "I can't believe this," she seemed to whisper. "I just can't believe it." And neither, it seems, can many other Americans. From coast to coast, they will pay their respects until the former president's body is laid to rest here at a sunset ceremony on Friday. David Willis, BBC News, at the Reagan Presidential Library in California.
Live-Bilder aus dem Kapitol in Washington. 4 Uhr morgens ist es dort. Die Amerikaner wollen dem ehemaligen Präsidenten der USA noch einmal ganz nah sein, bevor morgen der Staatsakt beginnt. Unzählige Amerikaner haben schon Abschied genommen. Es ist früh Uhr morgens, aber schon gestern Abend und auch heute im Laufe des ganzen Tages werden sicherlich noch zigtausende hier dem Ex-Präsidenten die letzte Ehre erweisen. Und viele, viele Menschen in vielen Ländern schließen sich den Trauerbekundungen an. Es gibt kaum ein Ereignis in Amerika, das so viel Anteilnahme gewinnt in diesen Tagen. Morgen findet der große Staatsakt in Washington statt. Dazu sind viele Staats- und Regierungschefs anderer Länder eingeladen. Unter anderem kommen ja auch die Staats- und Regierungschefs, die sich jetzt zum G8-Treffen in Georgia versammelt hatten. Darunter auch US-Präsident Bush. Entschuldigung, und darunter natürlich auch der Kanzler. Und hier die Bilder, wie gesagt, aus Washington vom Wachwechsel am Sarg Ronald Reagans.
And I know that my sister at first missed caring for him. On the other hand, it was such a burden on them.
In a sense, kind of a blessing, Mr. President?
Oh, definitely. The battle's over, the victory won. I mean, he fought this thing and without a lot of cognizance, but I think everybody said, look, it's been a long, long time. It's been a terrible burden on loyal, wonderful Nancy, but life goes on, and at 93. He's got so much that his life meant so much to so many people that I think it's now a celebration rather than a sadness.
And the two of you, of course, all of you are going to be interconnected forever in history. You as vice president. We'll get into a lot of that. One thing I want to talk about right away is this Saturday night, you're going to turn 80.
Yes, sir.
Your 80th birthday party is here in Houston at Minute Maid Park. I'm proud to be the MC of this. You're going to jump out of a parachute. You could jump with a parachute, out of a parachute. The next day, my doctor would not let me go with you. I had planned to go.
I know.
You still think he's a little nuts to do this, right?
No, I think this is what he wants to do. I know he's safer than safe, so I'm not going to worry.
Was there any thought to canceling?
Well, I think there was some thought, and then we said, look, after a week of mourning, a week of great sadness, life goes on. And in this case, we've got 5 world leaders, former world leaders coming here. We got 5,000 people. We've got a lot of planning that went into it. And so I think the final analysis, the committee decided that it should go on. And I think that was the right decision.
And the Points of Light are the charity that benefits from
Points of Light, plus the M.D. Anderson Cancer Center, plus the George Bush Library Foundation, which has our school and our museum there.
So it'll be my honor to be master of ceremony.
Well, I'll bet you Ronald Reagan would have loved it. I bet he
would have had a good time.
That's right.
With the talent especially. This is the first presidential funeral in the nation's capital in 31 years. The last was LBJ's back in 1973, and you're going to speak. Have you already prepared your remarks?
I'm working on them. But Larry, I got a problem. Maybe you can help me with it. I get too emotional. I get too emotional if I'm speaking and eulogizing somebody I love. And in this instance, I felt very close to the president.
So be emotional.
Well,
why not let it?
Just
right?
don't want to sob up there and not be able to say anything. So I'll try. I'll rehearse it, and I'm working on it. Mine's very short. The president is giving the main address there. And I was very flattered that Nancy wanted me to come and do this, but I'm going to try my hardest.
Tell what Ronald Reagan told you about that.
Once I asked him after Normandy, I said, Mr. President, how did you get through an emotional speech like that? He said, I wrote it down, and then I'd read it over and over again to myself, and out loud, but to myself. And he said, after a while, I'd get used to the words, and I'd know what they were, but I didn't feel it quite as much in my heart. But he was a master at that. Once in a while, he got emotional. He did a little bit on that point-to-hawk speech, but he was, he was superb communicator. And
what was
quite
it like?
Different than me.
What was it like to run against him when you challenged him in 1980 in that back and forth primaries?
It was pretty tough. We had some differences, but we had a lot of things in common. But he blew me away pretty early, although we did carry some pretty good-sized states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, a few others. Iowa's good to me. But it became clear that the country wanted him, that our party wanted him. And it was a marvelous moment when he called me at the hotel there and said he wanted me to be on his ticket, because the common wisdom was that it was going to be Gerald Ford.
You remember last night told us that they discussed it and it just didn't work.
Yeah. Well, that was my break.
How did he ask you?
He just called up, picked up the telephone.
He was on the phone?
Yeah. And just a few minutes before that, I'd said to our son Jeb, now the governor of Florida, who was saying, Dad, this isn't fair, that you ought to get this. I said, nobody owes us a thing, Jeb. And it looks like it's going to be Gerald Ford. We're going to keep our heads high and go back to our life. And
the phone rang.
Phone rang.
That's
it's
right.
Amazing. Phone rang.
And what did he simply say?
He said, George, I've been thinking about this, and I'd like you to be my running mate, or something like that. And he said something, well, can you I hope you can support the platform, or something like that. I said, no problem. And it was a great experience, perhaps the greatest in a sense in my life, because it gave me real preparation for what followed.
Were you happy that he decided to go for the vice presidency?
Yes, he didn't run for the vice presidency.
Oh, that he accepted
yes,
the offer.
But once, other people were running for the vice presidency, and I got thinking, well, I don't mean Jerry Ford either, but
no, there were others that wanted it.
There were others who wanted it, and their great speech was going to come or something, and I got sort of competitive, I have to confess, and thought, well, George's a much better man.
Surprise.
That's right.
Was he a great president? You know, the word great can get bandied around easily. Is
I
he
think
a great
so.
president?
I think history will say that, and a lot of it had to do with accomplishments. The Reagan Revolution, you might say, in terms of hammering home the need for lower taxes. People forget that the highest rate, maybe not when he became president, but it was up around 90%. And President Reagan articulated the need to get taxes down, even though Larry had to compromise a time or two on increasing them. But his greatness stemmed from his adherence to principle. You knew where he was on the issue. He was not sticking a finger up in the wind to see which the polls were doing or which way the wind was blowing. And so he was great at that. But the side that I think I probably saw better than most Americans was this personal side.
Tell me about it.
American people understood it, but I saw it up close and personal because every Thursday I'd have a lunch with him, or sometimes it was Wednesday, most was Thursday, have lunch there, and we'd talk, no agenda, no briefing papers, and what I saw was a certain decency and a certain sense of honor and a great sense of humor. And it was wonderful. Even when things were going tough, he'd tell me a joke, or I would to him. But it was that personal side of him that I hadn't known when I was chairman of the Republican Party.
And did he involve you? I mean, were you on top of everything? Some vice presidents have been like, let me know what's going on.
Well, he did, and that was the great thing. I think I was one of a very few handful of people that could just walk into his office. But yeah, I had certain assignments. I loved it when I went abroad for him. People say about, well, they said about me going to the Soviet Union, you die, Bush will fly. Well, the funny thing is I met Gorbachev for the first time and sent President Reagan a cable that I think today would hold up in my observation. But that was a wonderful assignment. There are many others, too, and I've had things that domestically.
And I understand President Gorbachev will be Saturday night. In addition at the funeral, he'll be Saturday night at the birthday party.
I hope he will. I think so.
We'll take a break, and we'll be right back with the Bushes in Houston. This is Larry King Live. Don't go away. Houstonian Hotel in Houston, Texas, with the 41st President of the United States, the only living president now with an airport named after him. We had 2 living presidents with airports named after him, Reagan National, now there's just Bush International here in Houston. What's that like, by the way, have an airport named after you?
Great honor. It's a wonderful honor.
I mean, when you fly in there.
Well, I feel when I hear him say, flying into Bush, fasten your seatbelts, you get a personal charge out of all of that.
Sad thing was President Reagan, I guess, never got to fly into Reagan National.
I think you're
right.
But
he knew it, didn't he? I'm sure he knew it.
I don't remember.
When you had a relative with Alzheimer's. How difficult
my
was
brother-in-law.
Yeah.
Well, for my sister, it was terrible. But he was lucky, and I say this in, well, he was lucky. He died in 5 years. That's lucky. The first 3 or 4, 2 years were very, very difficult, though, because he knew there was something, as I'm sure the president did. That's very difficult. But I think now that my sister was lucky.
How difficult was it for you on those occasions when there had to be occasions, when you didn't agree with President Reagan?
Well, it wasn't very difficult because I vowed that when I was accepted for this job and then elected with him, that I would not deviate publicly from what he said. So it wasn't difficult, because when I had a nuance of difference, I could talk to him like you and I are talking now, but without any cameras, and tell him what I thought. He never got angry, or he never, said, wait just a minute, you're on the wrong track here. And I always felt he welcomed suggestions that might deviate a little bit.
He wanted to hear?
Well, I think
so.
Some
presidents, they say, don't want to hear it.
Well, I think he did, and there weren't that many occasions. But at times there were some related to personnel and his administration that I might have a different view on how they were treating him. And
in fact, there's a story in today's New York Times, I don't know if you saw it, that you had this desire to see Donald Reagan go.
Me?
Yeah.
No, that was not I.
And then it says you and Nancy had a disagreement over how to tell the president.
That.
No, well, it's in the New York Times today.
Yeah. Well, what you read in the New York Times is not always true.
You and Nancy get along?
Yes.
Because the story implied that
we would never have discussed something like that. Maybe George would have with the president, but I never discussed that.
They had the two of you discussing it.
And what they had in there was totally inaccurate.
Did you see it?
In fact, yeah, I did. But I don't like to dwell on that kind of stuff.
Oh, really? It wasn't about you and Nancy and me. We never discussed that, and I think it would be offensive to Nancy and to me.
Where does a story like that come from, then? The only people who know about it are the four of you.
I remember distinctly President Reagan asking me if I'd talked to Don Regan about leaving, and I did. And so I remember intervening, but at his request. I wouldn't have done that without that.
He told me in an interview we did in 1991, and which we're going to replay Sunday night, that the hardest part to him was to fire someone.
Oh, he hated it. That's why I said when there might be nuances of difference, and they might be about personnel or something like that. But I would never go public with that. I mean, he was the president. I was the vice president. And I owed him my loyalty as well as my judgment.
Was that hard, though?
No.
No?
I have no personal agenda. It came later when I was running for president and when I was president. But no, it wasn't hard.
Did you like being Mrs. Vice President?
Loved it. You could say anything you wanted and nobody cared. You became the wife of the president, you couldn't say anything. Everybody cared.
And you wanted to say things, right?
I did, I'm afraid.
Let's talk about his faith. Was he a strong believer?
If you let me use a note on faith, I didn't know whether we were going to discuss it or not, but in his letter to the American people about this Alzheimer's, there was a couple of really nice references that I thought were pretty good. I'm now about to begin the journey into the sunset of my life. For America, I know there will always be a bright dawn ahead. Another, when God calls me home, whenever that may be, I will leave with the greatest love for this country of ours. And then I just sketched out one more. He believed that it came from somewhere, enjoyed the high side. He quoted Jefferson often. And here's the quote: "The God who gave us liberty, God who gave us life, gave us liberty as well." And then he spoke of the great beyond. So he had a strong faith. He wasn't always beating his chest about it, but he had a strong conviction that there was a hereafter. I think there was one reference in here where he talked about the difference between communists, a Marxist state, and a lot of the rest of the world, where they believed in God and believed in the hereafter.
And you share that belief?
Oh, yeah.
We asked the Fords about this last night, not to be maudlin, but do you know where your resting place will be?
You bet, and I'd be glad to show it to you.
Where is it?
It's at College Station. It's the prettiest place you ever saw. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, our daughter's already buried there. The one that died.
How old was she?
Almost 4.
So that was 50-some years ago.
Yeah.
And she's there, a little stone.
You'll be buried together there?
Yeah.
Right? At the, Is that
it's not
maudlin or comforting?
It's very comforting to us. The
Eddie
only thing
Ford said it's comforting.
It is comforting.
I went by there and these guys were working like mad. I said, "Hey, slow down, you fellas." I mean, but it's beautiful.
We'll be right back with the Bushes in Houston, Texas. Don't go away. back at the Houstonian Hotel in Houston, Texas, with the 41st President of the United States and his wife, the former First Lady, George and Barbara Bush. They will be at the funeral ceremony on Friday morning. We'll be anchoring the ceremony, the burial ceremony, on Friday afternoon at 9 o'clock regular Larry King Live time. Where were you when President Reagan was shot?
I was in Texas, in Fort Worth, and we heard that he was shot. The Secret Service rushed me back out to the airplane, Air Force 2, and as soon as we could, we headed back to Washington. But it was a real shock. But you know something, Larry? I said it at the time. I'll repeat it here. I didn't think about the loneliest burden in the world, the job of the presidency falling on my shoulders. We didn't know enough about what was happening. I thought that a friend had been shot. I thought it would be just a personal thing like that. And then, of course, as time went on and you had all the debate, who was running the country and landing where and there, it changed a little bit. But that was my first reaction. And that's what I'm trying to say about Ronald Reagan. You just felt a sense of friendship and closeness to the guy. We did. Barbara and I did.
Where were you?
I was actually just coming back from a luncheon with Nancy Reagan. We'd gone to Phillips Gallery, I think, at a luncheon, and then it was pretty scary. Ed Meese came out to the Vice President's house to tell me, which was very thoughtful.
Did it all enter your mind that you might be First Lady?
No, because Ed said George was coming back. Not at all. That sounds terribly stupid, but it didn't. I just wanted to be sure George was safe and back and that the president was fine.
Didn't you have to think about it on that plane flight?
A little bit back. I wrote some notes that are up there in my library, and I can't remember exactly what they were, but it didn't dwell on it because we really didn't know how serious. We get reports flying back, but none of them sounded like he was going to pass away, thank God. And there was no consideration given to transferring, that I know of, to transferring the powers of the president to the vice president. If that had happened, I would have, felt more, well, what do I do now kind of thing. But it didn't, and I never tried to act like I was president. I sat in a regular chair, landed the helicopter up at the vice president's instead of the South Lawn, and just went about my business, my job.
How soon after did you see him?
I don't remember. I don't know that I saw him in the hospital. I don't think so.
I think you did.
I may have.
I think
they weren't encouraging visitors. I don't think Nancy wanted
I think you went by the hospital and saw her and saw him.
He had
Not that day,
optimism
but
after
later.
that too, right?
Oh,
he was even funny.
Oh yeah, saying about the doctors. I hope you're all Republicans.
I forgot to duck, honey.
Things like that. And then one other wonderful incident where they found him on his hands and knees wiping up some water because he didn't want the nurse to get disciplined for spilling. I mean,
that was him, right?
That's
wonderful.
a
Classic example of him.
That's right.
He was innately polite.
Larry, he'd no more walk by the guy running the elevator in the White House or the fella doing the ground, Irv, out there and the groundskeepers and all that, without saying, how's your family? How's it going? What's happening? I mean, he just had that way of, I call it kindness or decency.
Did you ever think about assassination?
Maybe, but not, I guess I thought about it after I left the presidency and Saddam Hussein tried to knock us off, Barbara, me, and a whole bunch of others. But
didn't think about it while you were president?
No, they'd brief us if there were any serious threats, and there are always threats on the president. But oddly enough, I think more about it now than...
Yeah, do you think about it for your son?
No. I think the Secret Service... Well, I'm much more optimistic. I think the Secret Service are fabulous, and I think they'll take good care of him.
You do think about it?
Well, just once in a while, just because these Al-Qaeda people are nuts, and they'll do anything. But I agree with Barbara about the Secret Service. We have total confidence in it, and the intelligence is good. We get some excellent intelligence that they work on.
I think it was a blessing that President Reagan, arguably, I guess, didn't know about 9/11.
Yes, I think it's anybody who didn't know about it was lucky.
In a way, that's a good point, Larry, because it changed the dynamic for our whole country. We thought we were immune, protected by the Pacific, protected by the Atlantic, and suddenly this terror comes right home to our country.
By the way, where were you?
we spent the night in the White House that Sunday night. I think it was a Monday, wasn't it? And
was it
we had taken
We'd
off.
been at a cancer meeting on Monday, I think, and
Then we were flying out when we heard about it. We were going to Minnesota, and they grounded us in Milwaukee. A few hours later, the president called and said, "Where are you, Dad?" I said, "Well, you made us land out here in some little town outside of Milwaukee." So but it changed everything, and the country will be all right, though. The country will be all right. Reagan's optimism will prevail for the country even now.
We'll be right back with George and Barbara Bush, former president, former first lady. Don't go away.
This is CNN.
And especially Mrs. Nancy Reagan, who stood by him in memorable moments of history and never left him in the long moments of difficult performance when the wheel turned all so slowly.
We're back with the Bushes. What about Nancy during this period, Barbara, of the 10 years of a husband with Alzheimer's?
well, you just can't imagine unless you've been there, I guess. But
The long goodbye. That's what it's called.
very long goodbye. And they were so close that it must have just broken her heart because they literally were like one.
That was a genuine love affair.
Definitely. And you could sense it, and he'd talk about it quietly and privately as well as publicly. Remember up in Reykjavik, he said, told the troops, "I got to go home, Nancy's making dinner," or something like that. Well, that's, that was hyperbole, but it's what he was about. And it was a genuine love affair, and she set a huge example for the whole country in the way she has conducted herself over this long period of trouble.
I don't want to take you into politics, it's not the point, but Nancy's come out for stem cell research. I know your son has in certain areas come out not for that area. Have you got thoughts on it?
Well, he's come out for some of it. He just wants to restrict the amount of federal funding that goes into certain lines or something like that. I don't really know much about it. But there may be a difference there. But not with me. But I can see her anxiety about getting the federal government to do more.
Did you like her?
Yes, I admired her enormously. She, we're as different as night and day. I've forgotten once I had a good description. I've forgotten it now, but something like she wears a size, 2 and my leg is a size 2 or something. But we had just such different interests. I mean, I liked sports and we just did different things, but that did not take from my liking her very, very much. I have a lot of friends who are as beautiful as Nancy, which is hard to be, and don't do any athletics, and we're still very close friends.
Were you friends with Ronald Reagan?
I hope so. I like to think so. Maybe it's a little presumptuous for me to say so, but yes, in terms of my view of my friendships, I was. And I've been going through diaries, and there's so many intimate moments and so many wonderful...
You keep a diary?
Not anymore. I did, but I did it too sketchily when I was vice president and president. But the ones that interacted with the president was when I was vice president. And there are a lot of times when he was just so kind and wonderful that I think I was a friend, yeah.
That's nice. In other words, that you could level with him on personal feelings.
Definitely that. And I knew that he would not be, unless it was kind of agreed, be out telling, here's what George thinks, and he's wrong. I mean, behind my back doing something or saying something like that. The minute I was on that ticket, the minute we were elected, he was totally friendly, or in my corner, you might say. You remember the Carter debate, when he was debating Carter? And Carter said, well, your own vice president candidate down here called your economics voodoo economics. Reagan looked over at me and goes, like this, you know. And then he gave him a great answer. And it just put me at ease so much.
Instinct, right? His instincts worked well for him.
But its instinct was timing and communication, but it's an underlying decency, honor, kindness, humility, all of these things about which I learned so much from him.
Did you visit him all when he was ill?
Yeah. Well, no, not when he was ill. We visited him after I left the presidency, and I guess it might have been in the early stages of the illness.
Did you sense some of the early stages? Gerald Ford told us he did.
Yes, we did. When I didn't when he was president.
No,
I was at his side. Some people said then, and I never detected a trace of it then. But yeah, the time we saw him, or maybe it was twice. I think I saw him twice. One of them it was quite clear that there were some disconnects.
Was that hard to take? You're sitting with you're a former leader of the free world, he's a former leader of the free world, and he's not connecting.
Yeah, it was. It was complicated and sad. I saw him after he left office when I was president, and those were very nice occasions. I remember he went out to his library opening, and then we were at the thing for Desert Storm, and so we'd see each other. We gave him the Medal of Freedom.
I was there the day you gave him the Medal of
Came
Nancy.
there.
I was
and these were wonderful occasions, but I don't remember, Larry, any disconnects in those years when I was president. Maybe it started.
Did you notice it in your brother-in-law?
Well, I lived in Texas, he lived in Connecticut, and I know they went through a miserable year he was an investment banker, wasn't he? Yes, he was a G.H. Walker. He was not related, but he was. And his wife took away some of his accounts, gently said to people, you better move on. And he didn't like that very much because he knew there was something wrong, but it wasn't easy.
When we come back, President Reagan on the world stage. We're at the Houstonian Hotel in Houston, Texas, with the 41st President of the United States and Barbara. Don't go away.
So, George, I'm in your corner. I'm ready to volunteer I'm ready to volunteer a little advice now and then and offer a pointer or two on strategy if asked. I'll help keep the facts straight or just stand back and cheer. But George, just one personal request. Go out there and win one for the Gipper.
Barbara just told me a wonderful little anecdote we ought to share on coming back from China.
Well, we carried home a present for him and wrapped it all up for them, Nancy and the president, and wrapped it up. And about 2 days before Christmas, I got a little note. Dear Barbara, I said, I just couldn't stand it when I saw you carried this home from China, and so I opened early. I love it. Thank you very much.
From the president?
The president. He wrote the thank you note. Like all kids, he opened early.
I always try to think of what you can do for a president. I used to go twice, I remember going to Al's Magic Shop. And they had trying to find a couple of clean items I could pick up for the president. And, you know, you'd take him there and he'd laugh, and we'd had a lot of fun with that kind of thing.
How about how well he handled himself on the world stage? There were great fears when he took office with how well would Reagan do with the leaders of other countries.
Larry, there was so much hand-wringing in the kind of conventional foreign policy establishment when he said something like, this is an evil empire. And when he said, tear down the wall, people, oh my God, this is going to cause World War III, you know, and all kinds of consternation. But the way in which he did it, you knew where he stood. It was very powerful, very strong, but it wasn't mean-spirited. And it wasn't trying to, you know, to stick a finger in the other leader's eyes, even though he said, Mr. Gorbachev, take down the wall. I think if you asked Gorbachev about that, he would rationalize and say, wait a minute, we could understand back then his feeling. So it was important. And he took on the foreign policy establishment and emerged, I think, with flying colors.
You know, as you appreciated how well were you a little surprised at how well he handled it? Because he didn't have any international experience,
in
right?
the beginning, yeah, you just didn't know. But I think he ended up doing very, very well, even in Reykjavik, where they had to reverse himself a little bit. But people said, look, he was trying for peace. He was trying to get rid of these nuclear weapons. He was trying to, you know, do something for world peace. And I think that is what came through, even to those people who were wringing their hands in the beginning about the heat of his rhetoric.
How good was the team around him? Colin Powell will be with us tomorrow night. Really? He made Colin Powell his national security.
Oh, yeah, God, he's one of the best. Colin is just, of course, I'm so prejudiced. Well, I'm prejudiced because I just feel, again, a certain sense of friendship with him that's never going to be diminished. I mean, there's crisis here, crisis there, but hey, he's a wonderful person, and he could give you a very good insight into President Reagan. I'm sure he will.
Did Reagan have generally, President Reagan, a good team?
I think so. I think at times he felt that it might have been stronger, but you know, I think when he chose Jimmy Baker right at the beginning, who had opposed him, who had been my campaign manager, but he saw in Baker a certain strength that I think the country really sees ex post facto. That was broad gauge view. It didn't have to always be there. And the kitchen cabinet kind of guy, he said, this guy will help me, and he did.
How well did he handle criticism, press criticism?
Just rolled off him. I tell you, he did a lot better than I do. He just rolled off his back. And it's just the way he'd do it. I mean, you know, hi, and come on. And he didn't like it. I mean, at times he felt he was really hammered.
Was Iran-Contra the toughest time?
I think it probably was, Larry. And I think the speech he gave where he said, I told you I didn't trade heads, or I still think I didn't, but this is the evidence and it looks like I may have, or something. I mean, I don't ever remember it being totally down, but you could just tell it was a burden on him.
How about the loss in Lebanon?
Same thing. I remember I went over there, you mean when the Marine barracks?
Yeah.
I remember I went over there the day after that, kicked through the rubble at Lebanon. He wanted me to do that, and I was glad he did. But I think in that course of a conversation there, you could tell that it was hurting him, but it was I don't think he worried about his own standing. I think what he's worried about is the loss of those young Marines.
Is that the worst part of the presidency? Losing lives in your command?
Yeah. The worst part is sending somebody else's son or daughter into harm's way. I felt that way. I know the president feels that way. And I expect, though President Reagan didn't have to do it as much, felt that way. And I expect Jimmy Carter did.
Does it affect you? As First Lady, did it affect you?
Yes, because it affects your husband and it affects young lives.
It's the toughest. There's no question. It's not even arguable what's tougher than that, because you can't pass the buck, can't form a committee, can't go to get Congress to pass them. You got to say, I'm going to do this. And
there's a movement. Mitch McConnell of Kentucky, a friend of yours, has started a movement to put President Reagan on the $10 bill. Take Alexander Hamilton off and put him on. What do you think?
Well, I think it's probably going to take a little time to get that done, but I think it's, I'd be all for it. I'll vote aye.
Would you be for it?
Yes, I would, but then they're going to go through every president, maybe. I can't wait to see what George is going to be.
Well, I think there's a long wait. In fact, I think President Reagan signed a bill about before you can change it.
That's why I said
they can be changed.
Yeah, before it can be changed.
Mm-hmm. I think it's going to take a while. Mitch is very able, though. Don't underestimate McConnell.
It's very hard, but there'll be other American heroes who people want to put on bills. I guess I'm less political and more practical than you. I mean, they're going to want to put Martin Luther King. A lot of American heroes.
Oh, these are presidents, though. They're not going to...
Well, I know.
Hamilton wasn't president.
Is he on one? Is that the one you're talking
about? $10 bill.
That a boy. Thank you
Secretary
very
of the Treasury,
much.
so Barbara's right.
For once.
Once again.
Well, I don't know. I think it would be wonderful, but I just suspect that everyone's going to come up with someone else.
When we come back, we'll have our last segment, and we'll talk about the aging process.
Well, who's aging?
The president's going to be 80 on Saturday. He's going to jump out of an airplane on Sunday. We'll be right back.
And possibly to simplify even some very complex issues. And he presented some very concise, very clear messages that really appealed to the American people.
Even when we had our differences about domestic policy, the one thing I liked about him was that he was not mean-spirited. He was always optimistic about our country, and he believed that freedom was a universal value.
His work is done, and now a shining city awaits him. May God bless Ronald Reagan.
They are an exclusive club, and they are not getting younger. There is now Gerald Ford, Bill Clinton, George Herbert Walker Bush. You think about...
Jimmy Carter.
And Jimmy Carter. Do you think about...
Dying?
Yeah.
A little bit, but not a lot. It doesn't scare me. Used to. When I was a little kid, think about dying, I would scare that. Terrible. But when you get older, Larry, you know, you don't think about it a lot. I got too much to do, too much to live for, too much happiness to
Does
depart
80
from.
seem old?
No, oddly enough, it doesn't. You think I'm probably think I'm exaggerating, but it doesn't. And part of that is I'm blessed with good health, and I still want to do things. I still want to get out and do interesting stuff. They named an aircraft carrier for me. It's going to go to sea. It's christened earlier. It's going to go to sea in 2008. The George H.W. Bush CVN 77. I got to be alive for that. I've got to go out on that ship and relive my own days in the Navy.
Did you christen it?
No, our daughter.
Our daughter's the sponsor. It's her ship.
Isn't that exciting?
Do you think about aging? Do you think about...
I think about his aging, praying he'll age someday, but no, I really don't. I think we're all limited slightly by aches and pains, but no, we feel good.
How do you feel about him jumping, really?
Really, I think it's
Really?
great. I mean, the military men he jumps with, or women, are very, very talented. They're not going to let anything happen to
Why
him.
do you do it?
One, it feels good. It's exhilarating. It's like, why do I go 68 miles an hour in my boat? Which I do when I go fishing. I do. And there's a certain thrill in it when you're falling at 125 miles an hour and you're the one in control. It's not a tandem. It's just me. And with the guy there in case I mess up. But there's a thrill in it. And the second thing, Larry, is you asked how, about 80. I think it sends a message around the country, and I think it will around the world in this instance, that just because you're 80, that doesn't mean you can't do fun stuff or interesting things. You can,
Boy,
and I am.
Looking forward to your birthday bash?
Yeah, look, and we're thrilled you're coming, incidentally.
It's an honor to be
Very
the master
pleased.
ceremonies at this. And
It's going to be fun.
gonna be all the kids going to be there, everybody?
Yeah.
Grandchildren?
I think most of them. No, the twins are gone. They're overseas. The
Anything
president's
you'd
kids.
want to say to Nancy?
Well, we've talked to her, and she knows that our hearts are with her.
You talked to her soon after?
No, we talked to her just before, but it was there.
Like 5 minutes, 10 minutes before.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Right before he died?
Yeah. But I guess she knew it because she said, well, she made clear to us that he wasn't going to live. My message would be that what you've done is set an example for how to cope with grief, and an example of standing by the guy that loved you most, your husband. And she did it.
And what's his legacy?
I don't know, Larry.
Decency.
Yeah, all those personal attributes.
Giving hope. He gave huge hope to this country.
Yeah. Morning in America. We're the greatest. We're the best, without putting anyone else down.
And that wasn't PR, right?
No.
I mean, that was him.
It's in his heart, yeah. It's in his heart. America the free, home of the free. land of the brave. I mean, he loved all that, and he conveyed it to the American people.
It's okay to be emotional on Friday. When do you head to Washington?
We go up there tomorrow afternoon, and then I got to give a little eulogy there. But I'm the one that leads the BAWL, B-A-W-L patrol in our family. And I can do it when I'm happy, and if I'm saying something about someone I love and respect, I'm afraid the tears will flow, but I'm going to try to find something to dry them up.
Is it good to be around former presidents?
Yeah, I like it. I enjoyed seeing President Clinton at the World War II Memorial the other day, and people said, well, what were you talking about? I said, we're just friendly, you know, anecdotes.
Thank you so much,
Great respect
Bob.
for him.
Always great seeing you.
Excuse my left hand. I got a sprained thumb, and this is the hand that pulls the parachute.
The hand that pulls the parachute is sprained.
Well, just the thumb, but I just want to be sure it doesn't get injured
Trust
by a
me,
good warm handshake from you.
When the moment comes, his thumb will be able to pull the thing.
We'll see you Saturday night.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you for joining us, and I'll be back in a minute to tell you about tomorrow.
Der Sarg von Ronald Reagan, hier Live-Bilder aus dem Kapitol in Washington. Die Amerikaner erweisen ihrem ehemaligen Präsidenten die letzte Ehre. Morgen beginnt dann der Staatsakt, mehr dazu im Verlauf dieser Sendung. Präsidenten Ronald Reagan. In einer bewegenden Trauerzeremonie ist sein Sarg zum Kapitol in Washington überführt worden. Morgen wird der im Alter von 93 Jahren verstorbene Politiker mit einem Staatsakt geehrt und anschließend im engsten Familienkreis beigesetzt.
Der Tod hat sie geschieden, doch auch jetzt weicht sie nicht von seiner Seite. Noch nicht. Mehr als 50 Jahre waren Nancy und Ronald Reagan verheiratet und jetzt dieser lange Abschied. Nancy Reagan trägt ihn mit Fassung. Wir wussten, dieser Moment würde kommen, aber das macht es nicht einfacher. Vizepräsident Cheney spricht damit wohl auch der Witwe aus dem Herzen. Amerika nimmt Abschied von seinem 40. Präsidenten. Bis zur Trauerfeier am Freitag in Washington bleibt der Sarg aufgebahrt. Die Rotunde im Kapitol ist auch in der Nacht geöffnet. Zu den vielen, die kommen, gehört auch Margaret Thatcher, die frühere britische Premierministerin. Zahlreiche ranghohe Trauergäste, auch aus dem Ausland, werden noch in Washington erwartet. Der letzte Staatschef der Sowjetunion, Gorbatschow, will Reagan die letzte Ehre erweisen, ebenso wie Kanzler Schröder. In einem feierlichen Trauerzug war der Sarg gestern zum Kapitol gebracht worden. Rund 2000 Soldaten begleiteten die Prozession. Tausende säumten den Straßenrand. Im Trauerzug ein reiterloses Pferd mit Reagans Cowboystiefeln. Sie steckten verkehrt herum in den Steigbügeln, ein Symbol für den Abschied des früheren Oberbefehlshabers der Streitkräfte von seinen Truppen. Nach schwerer Krankheit war Reagan am Samstag im Alter von 93 Jahren gestorben. Der überzeugte Antikommunist regierte die USA von 1981 bis 1989. Reagan wird am Freitagabend in Kalifornien beigesetzt, im engsten Kreis der Familie. Dann muss auch Nancy Reagan endgültig Abschied nehmen.
Auch in Berlin wird des verstorbenen US-Präsidenten gedacht. In der amerikanischen Botschaft liegt ein Kondolenzbuch aus. Darin gibt es seit heute Morgen auch einen Eintrag der CDU-Vorsitzenden Merkel. Reagan habe mit Mut und Vision Europa ein großes Stück Freiheit gebracht, schrieb sie.
Horse-drawn gun carriage with thousands of people lining the route of the cortege. Thousands more are expected to pay their respects before Friday's state ceremony.
At the heart of American power and influence, a chance to say farewell to a president and to his grieving widow.
God bless you, Nancy!
Tens of thousands braved the sticky heat to watch the pomp and ceremony. A gun carriage bore President Reagan's body. Next, a riderless horse, boots backwards in the stirrups, honoring a fallen warrior.
It's certainly not a festive occasion. This is the middle of a week of mourning, after all. But people have come down here to the center of their nation's capital to see an event that they know will be part of history.
It's an honor to be here at this time in this place, to have the opportunity to see, one of
America's greatest leaders.
From what I know, he was a great president, but I wasn't even born yet when he was in office, so I'm really honored to be here.
Inside the Capitol building, invited guests heard tributes to an American leader. Baroness Thatcher bade farewell to a dear personal and political friend. The body will lay in state, with the public paying their respects until a church service on Friday. Daniel Lack, BBC News, Washington.
There's one main story this morning here.
Then mourning Ronald Reagan, thousands paid tribute to a former president lying in state. You're watching CNN. Thousands of Americans are filing into the U.S. Capitol Rotunda to pay their respects to their 40th president. Those are the live pictures that you're seeing there right now this early Thursday morning. Now, on Wednesday, the Rotunda hosted the first formal ceremony of Reagan's state funeral. It marked the end of a day of events spanning the U.S. from West Coast to East. Beginning in California, a band played Amazing Grace as a military honor guard placed Reagan's coffin aboard a former Air Force One jet. His widow, Nancy, and his 3 children accompanied him on the flight to Washington. At Andrews Air Force Base, the late president was greeted by a 21-gun salute before he was placed aboard a waiting hearse. Then a motorcade escorted Reagan through the streets of Washington to the White House, where he was transferred to a horse-drawn caisson for the procession to the Capitol. Now, here's a bit more on what's ahead in the next few days. Reagan's body will lie in state until 7 a.m. Friday after an anticipated 200,000 people view the casket in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol. Sources tell CNN former president and Reagan's vice president, George Bush, and former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev will visit today. A funeral service will be held Friday at Washington National Cathedral, and Reagan will be interred later that day in a private ceremony at his presidential library in California. Well, the timeline of U.S. history is well marked by state funerals. The first was held for William Henry Harrison back in 1841. He was the first U.S. president to die in office. There have been 7 presidential state funerals in all before Reagan's. Tom Foreman reports on what this ceremony takes from those that preceded it.
No other state funeral has produced more unforgettable images than that of John Kennedy. The rolling caisson, his son saluting, the grief of a nation. Yet it was Jackie Kennedy, in her grief, who defined how a modern state funeral, how Ronald Reagan's funeral will be conducted.
She sent historians to the Library of Congress in the middle of the night to research the Lincoln funeral proceedings. And so after that, a very large report was prepared. We followed that report pretty much since 1965 when that was done.
Much of the ceremony Mrs. Kennedy revived can be traced to Lincoln. Lincoln's funeral procession was the first to feature a riderless horse, like the one that followed President Reagan. The catafalque, or decorative stand on which President Reagan's casket now rests, was built for Lincoln, the first president to lie in state in the Capitol Rotunda. It has been used for all 9 presidents who have lain in state there since, although 4 non-presidents have also been given that honor. All were military men, an unknown soldier from World War I, another representing World War II and the Korean conflict, General John Pershing and General Douglas MacArthur. Of all Americans, only about half are old enough to have seen a president lie in state at the Capitol. The last one was Lyndon Johnson in 1973. Richard Nixon died 10 years ago, but his funeral was in California. So, as he did in life, Ronald Reagan is showing America something new and at once old, the way a nation comes together to mourn, show respect, and say goodbye. Tom Foreman, CNN, Washington.
That their last respects to Ronald Reagan. The body of the former U.S. president arrived in Washington Wednesday aboard a jet from California. More than 200,000 people are expected to view the flag-draped coffin before his funeral at Washington National Cathedral on Friday. Well, visitors to the U.S. Capitol have about 24 hours left to pay their respects to Ronald Reagan. Lines are expected to be long and slow-moving. Elaine Quijano joins us now from the Botanical Garden outside the Capitol, where people are lining up to say their goodbyes to the former president. Elaine.
Hello, Monita. Well, this is a much different scene from just 24 hours ago when it was really just a trickle of people who were beginning to form a line. But as you take a look behind me now, you will see that certainly has grown. It has been a steady stream of people since really yesterday afternoon when they started arriving in earnest after President Reagan's casket made it to the Capitol Rotunda. We have seen this throughout the evening, people coming from near and far. And joining us now, one of those people, George Taroni, who actually didn't have too far to travel, just Arlington, Virginia, a short distance from here. But why did you want to come out today and pay your respects in person?
The reason I came is because I wanted to show my support to the family. I really have a great respect for what the family has been going through the last 10 years. My father has Parkinson's disease. I see how my mother takes care of him, and I really feel a great respect for Nancy Reagan and for what she's done to take care of her husband. I know that was very, very difficult.
Did you see the service yesterday, the ceremony, and were you able to catch any of that?
On TV, but
on
not
TV.
in person.
What was that like, and especially in your personal circumstance, to know the difficulties that she and her children have had to go through?
Well, I feel like they've suffered a lot, and a lot of it's kind of a quiet suffering that the family has to go through because other people can't really understand that fully. And I was really glad that there was so much support for the family and for her.
For you, that's certainly part of the connection. But as for President Reagan's legacy, what was it about President Reagan that sort of affected you so deeply during his time in office?
I think his biggest contribution was to help the end of communism. And I think he did a great job, and along with the Gorbachev and pushing that along.
What is it like for you to be here at this moment, knowing that you are a part of really American history in the making?
Well, I'm glad to see that there's so many people here, and the Capitol is a special place, and this is a special town for him. So I'm glad to see the support for him, and I want to be a part of that.
George Taroni from nearby Arlington, Virginia, thank you very much for joining us today. So that's just one of the stories that we have been hearing this morning. Many of the people who have been coming have personal connections, they feel, in some way, shape, or form to either the Reagan family or President Reagan himself. Some of them telling us that President Reagan, for them, not only was a great communicator, but a source of great hope for them. We've also seen, we should mention, many people in military uniforms who say that President Reagan did a lot, they believe, for the armed forces during his time in office. So a lot of people here expressing a very deep affection for President Reagan as they move through and make their way to the Capitol Rotunda today. Manita?
All right, Elaine, thank you for that. Elaine Quijano reporting to us there from Washington. Well, if you'd like to know more about the state funeral ceremonies for former U.S. President Ronald Reagan, log on to CNN.com. You'll find articles on Reagan's life and legacy, video, as well as photo galleries, and an interactive look at what to expect in the next 2 days. Go to CNN.com/Reagan. We'll be back. These are live pictures inside, just outside the U.S. Capitol. Visitors are lining up to pay their last respects to former U.S. President Ronald Reagan. His body arrived in Washington Wednesday aboard a jet from California, accompanied by his wife and children. Some 200,000 people are expected to view the flag-draped coffin before his funeral Friday at Washington National Cathedral. Well, a longtime friend of Ronald Reagan's is among those saying goodbye. Former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher paid her respects before the flag-draped casket Wednesday night. She joined the dignitaries who attended a service before the public viewing began. Thatcher, the closest of President Reagan's Cold War allies, also plans to attend his funeral on Friday. Well, like the Bush-Blair partnership and the Roosevelt-Churchill alliance, the Reagan-Thatcher relationship was strong. Margaret Thatcher preceded Ronald Reagan in office by 2 years, and she remained at 10 Downing Street for nearly 2 more years after Reagan's departure from the White House. Some have credited Reagan, Thatcher, and Pope John Paul II for the demise of the Soviet Union and the fall of communism in Eastern Europe. It was Thatcher who told Reagan and other world leaders that Mikhail Gorbachev appeared to be a Soviet leader they could do business with. Well, we're going to talk more about that historic alliance and unique friendship between Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. We're joined by Lord Geoffrey Howe, a member of the British House of Lords and a former British Foreign Secretary under Mrs. Thatcher's government. Lord Howe, thank you very much for being with us. They're described as the Gipper and the Iron Lady. How would you describe the two very different, they had very different personalities. What do you think made that relationship work?
I think they had the same instinctive principles which they shared, and above all, in face of the Soviet Union, they were determined that we had to stand together, be robust, face Russia down, and they were together in recognizing Mikhail Gorbachev, as Margaret Thatcher described him, as a man with whom I can do business. I was there when she made that judgment, and within a week she was in the White House telling President Reagan that that was her view. I think that the three of them created the partnership that brought the Cold War to an end.
Prime Minister Thatcher, former Prime Minister Thatcher said of Mr. Reagan that he was the second most important man in her life. What do you remember most about the former president?
I think his skill as a great communicator, as everyone described him, but a much more original, self-generated man than some patronizing people suggest. The theory of some critics is that he was a B-movie star who spoke other people's words. I remember a particular occasion, a NATO summit meeting, at which all 16 heads of government spoke. And Ronald Reagan was speaking last at the end of this long debate. At the end, when the time came to speak, he thrust his speaking notes to one side. He turned to George Shultz and said, "I think I'll take this one on the wing, George." And he did, and he spoke for 10 minutes, summing up the debate, explaining why we in NATO were democratically elected, had many values which we shared. The Warsaw Pact were slaves of a tyrant. And he moved that gathering of hard-boiled statesmen and diplomats almost to tears. It was a very impressive performance. And it was that quality, the ability to sum up people's thinking on issues of principle, that impressed people most.
What was it about, when we're talking about the partnership and the friendship between current President Bush and Prime Minister Tony Blair, also with Roosevelt and Churchill, and of course Reagan and Thatcher, what do you think it was the most important aspects of these relationships that really did make this transatlantic relationship work?
Well, I think that it's unrealistic to compare the Bush-Blair partnership with that between Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, because the Bush-Blair partnership had been engaged in some very highly criticized activities together, and they didn't cement the Western alliance, whereas Reagan and Thatcher provided the leadership for the entire free world on agreed principles. It was the sharing of the common heritage, the sharing of the common need for courage, the ability to draw the rest of the world together that characterized the Thatcher-Reagan relationship, as indeed it did the Churchill-Roosevelt relationship. They were both leading the world against acknowledged tyrannies, much less controversial than the Blair-Bush partnership.
Do you think President Reagan's, the style of his presidency would work today?
I think the style essentially was being approachable, being intelligible. There's a great book called Reagan in His Own Right, which shows the 700 sound broadcasts he made between leaving the governorship of California and becoming president of the States. He was a man who knew his own thoughts, could communicate them very directly, and very informally. I've sat around the table with him at G7 summit meetings, and he kept the conversation going. It was full of humor, full of insight. He was a really approachable and genial personality with a real grasp of principle as well.
Yeah, he was very approachable. He was described as being very laid back as well, but Prime Minister Thatcher was not described as being very laid back. In fact, she was also described as being a workhorse, someone who, again, was described as being the Iron Lady. So what do you think it was then about the two of them that clicked?
Well, I think that what clicked was they shared the same principles. You're quite right in saying they were very different people. Margaret Thatcher was a workaholic. She had details at her fingertips on everything. President Reagan, far from it. But President Reagan worked with supporters and advisors like George Shultz. He could see the main point. And I think that there was a personal chemistry between Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. He was one of the few people to whom Margaret deferred. In his presence, you could see her acknowledging her second place, so to speak, which was unusual for her. There was a real affection and respect in that relationship.
Do you think having Prime Minister Thatcher on his side, do you think that helped his credibility as well, helped raise his credibility for those, especially among those who actually did think of him as a B-class actor?
I think that's right, and I've seen her explaining, for example, to Commonwealth conferences, to people like Mrs. Indira Gandhi, the Premier of India, how seriously Reagan intended to try and bring the Cold War to an end. The fact that Margaret was able to communicate the credibility of the Reagan position to a wider audience who had respect for her, I think helped the partnership to work rather well. They didn't always agree on everything. I can remember occasions when she was really pretty angry with him over the invasion of Grenada, for example. And Ronald Reagan, on that occasion, he got a telephone call from her in which he was holding the headset away from his ear because it was so loud. So that they spoke frankly to each other, but there was a bond of affection as well as principle between them.
What is your fondest memory of President Reagan?
I think the way in which he took the chair at that Williamsburg summit when Margaret Thatcher had gone back to England and I had the privilege of sitting with them at the round table of leaders, the way in which, the style in which he was able to draw diverse personalities like President Mitterrand, Prime Minister Nakasone, Chancellor Kohl, despite the language difficulties, he radiated enthusiasm, sincerity, and a sense of purpose.
When you look at the issues and the problems that plague the United States and the world today, what do you think will be and is President Reagan's legacy?
I think that President Reagan's legacy undoubtedly was the key role by his courage and firmness in bringing the Cold War to an end. It wouldn't have happened without Mikhail Gorbachev, of course, but President Reagan provided the backbone.
The body of former U.S. President Ronald Reagan is lying in state in the Capitol Rotunda in Washington, while mourners file past as they have throughout the night. Reagan's casket arrived late Wednesday and is to remain in the Rotunda for 24 hours ahead of Friday's state funeral, the first for a U.S. president in some 30 years. Skip Loescher reports.
The flag-draped casket carrying Mr. Reagan's remains was placed on a horse-drawn ceremonial caisson for the funeral procession up Constitution Avenue from near the White House to the U.S. Capitol. Along the route of the procession, thousands of Americans reviewed the caisson as it ever so slowly passed by. At the Capitol, the late president's body was placed on a bier first used for President Lincoln's funeral. Mr. Reagan will be the first president since Lyndon Johnson in 1973 to rest below the 180-foot-high dome of the Capitol Rotunda. After members of Congress paid their tribute to the late president, the public will be allowed inside to pay its last respects.
President Reagan gave so much of himself to this country. Giving a few hours of my time is nothing to pay my last respects.
Despite the heat and humidity, many are expected to wait hours for the chance to say goodbye. The line, which officials say may top 200,000, is expected to stretch almost as far as you can see. After a church service at the National Cathedral, Mr. Reagan's body will be flown to California for good. Skip Loescher, CNN, Washington.
Well, it is just after 7 in the morning in Washington, and the line of people waiting to pay their last respects is getting longer. Ed Henry joins us now live outside the Capitol building among those who are waiting to walk past the coffin. Ed, what are you seeing there in terms of the lineups? Are people waiting, and what are they saying about why it's important for them to be there?
Oh, there's been a several-hour wait for people to get in. As you mentioned, thousands and thousands planning to stream past the coffin. Over the next 24 hours, it's going to be the Capitol Rotunda will be open until early Friday morning before the ceremony at the Washington National Cathedral. What we're hearing a lot of people say is that they obviously want to honor the former president, but also many of them pointing out that they really feel an outpouring of support for Nancy Reagan, not just this week and how she has carried herself with a quiet dignity, but the fact that she has endured over these last 10 years as a former president, had a very difficult battle with Alzheimer's disease. Monita.
Ed, Americans are being described as very patriotic people. What are they saying about this president's legacy? What do they say they will remember the most about Ronald Reagan?
What has been interesting is that we're seeing almost as many Democrats as Republicans coming forward in the United States and saying that they see that he, first of all, helped end the Cold War. It was because of him. Many here believe that communism fell. Also, Republicans believe that he turned around the U.S. economy. You'll get a little bit more of a spirited debate there from Democrats. They're not necessarily on board with that. They still disagree with a lot of former President Reagan's tax cuts and his economic policies. But you are seeing an outpouring of support, really both parties in the United States coming together and wanting to pay tribute to him and his family. This is the first state funeral that the United States has seen for a former president in 31 years.
All right, Ed, thank you for that. Ed Henry in Washington. The former president's wife, Nancy Reagan, was greeted with applause by the crowds that lined the streets in Washington. Former U.S. President George Bush had an explanation for that reaction.
The battle's over, the victory won. I mean, he fought this thing and without a lot of cognizance, but I think everybody said, look, it's been a long, long time. It's been a terrible burden on loyal, wonderful Nancy. But life goes on, and at 93, he's got so much that his life meant so much to so many people that I think it's now a celebration rather than a sadness.
Now, here's a bit more on what's ahead in the next few days. Reagan's body will lie in state until 7 a.m. Friday. 200,000 people are expected to view the casket in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol. Former President George Bush, who served as Reagan's vice president, and former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev are expected to visit Thursday. A funeral service will be held Friday at Washington National Cathedral. And Reagan will be interred later that day in a private ceremony at his presidential library in California. And if you'd like to know more about the state funeral ceremonies for former U.S. President Ronald Reagan, do log on to CNN.com. There you'll find articles on Reagan's life and legacy, video and photo galleries, and an interactive look at what to expect in the days ahead. That's at CNN.com/Reagan.
Facts. Mr. Reagan died last Saturday at the age of 93. We're going to have continuing coverage of the tribute to Ronald Reagan and coverage of the funeral service at the National Cathedral on Friday. The commemorations for the late U.S. President Ronald Reagan, reminiscent of those for Abraham Lincoln or John F. Kennedy. As Reagan's body lies in state under the Capitol dome, tens of thousands of ordinary people are filing by to pay their respects, many after waiting long hours in line. Mr. Reagan died last Saturday at the age of 93.
Ed Henry's covering this public tribute at the Capitol. He's been talking to mourners in line. Ed, what are they saying?
Well, we're hearing from a lot of people, dignitaries and also people from all around the world who want to pay their respects. One person I talked to was Senator Edward Kennedy, the Democratic U.S. Senator, who said that when he was in the Capitol Rotunda last night for the very sad ceremony, it brought back a lot of painful memories from his own brother's state funeral in 1963 when President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. But Senator Kennedy said that he was really inspired by the way Nancy Reagan seems to be taking this with real grace and dignity. I didn't get to speak to him, but we had live pictures a short while ago of former U.S. Senator Bob Dole filing past the coffin. Now, he's a Republican, somebody who agreed with Ronald Reagan on a lot of things, but there were other policies such as tax cuts where Dole sparred a little bit with Ronald Reagan over the years. But you can see people in both parties obviously putting aside any differences to come forward and pay their respects.
Ed, I apologize, I didn't realize you were finished. One question about dignitaries. Do they have to wait in line, or is there a specific protocol that they undergo when they get there?
We've seen a stream of motorcades coming throughout the day, and our understanding is that they were going to get, sort of expedited in, because you have a lot of dignitaries, such as former British Prime Minister, of course, Margaret Thatcher, who was in last night. Mikhail Gorbachev, the former leader of the Soviet Union, is going to be coming in at some point today. Also, former U.S. President George Bush is going to come in, separate from his own son, the current U.S. President George W. Bush, who is going to be coming in with the First Lady this evening, Eastern Standard Time. And we understand that after that meeting, after that viewing of the casket, President Bush is going to have a direct meeting with Nancy Reagan, who is staying at the Blair House right across the street from the White House, trying to get some downtime today to get ready for that very big memorial service at the Washington National Cathedral on Friday, where there will be dozens and dozens of heads of state from all around the world, the diplomatic corps represented very well, in addition to members of Congress and close family friends. Zane.
Ed Henry, thanks.
Thank you.
A longtime friend of Ronald Reagan is among those who is saying goodbye. Former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, we just mentioned, paid her respects before the flag-draped casket on Wednesday night. She joined the dignitaries who attended a service before the public viewing began. Mrs. Thatcher, the closest of President Reagan's Cold War allies, repeatedly standing by his side, supporting one another. She plans to attend his funeral on Friday.
When the former president's wife, Nancy Reagan, arrived in Washington, she was greeted with applause by the crowds that lined the streets. The man who served as Reagan's vice president offered some thoughts about that.
The battle's over, the victory won. I mean, he fought this thing and without a lot of cognizance, but I think everybody said, look, it's been a long, long time. It's been a terrible burden on loyal, wonderful Nancy. But life goes on, and at 93, he's got so much that his life meant so much to so many people that I think it's now a celebration rather than a sadness.
Marking the end of President Reagan's life, we've got a lot on store for you. Let me give you an idea of what's ahead over the next 2 days. The former president's body is going to lie in state, of course. That will happen until 7 a.m. on Friday morning. Some 200,000 people are expected to view the casket in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol. You've seen some pictures of that. It's going to go on. Former President George Bush and former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev expected to visit on Thursday. Then a funeral service is going to be held Friday at Washington National Cathedral. And then Mr. Reagan will be interred later that same day. It will be a private ceremony. That will be at his presidential library in California. For more on all of this, be sure to visit our website at CNN.com. You'll find articles on Reagan's life and legacy, video, photo galleries, as well as an interactive look at what to expect in the days ahead. All of it is waiting for you at CNN.com/Reagan.
This people who didn't know Reagan, young children coming in, coming to pay their respects and attending the cortege ceremony yesterday that we saw, a ceremony full of pomp and splendor, as Ronald Reagan's body was laid here to lie in state until Friday morning, where it'll be taken then to a service at Washington's National Cathedral.
We'll have more special coverage of events in Washington coming up. Stay with us.
Trauer in Kalifornien wurde der Sarg nach Washington überführt. Und auch in der US-Hauptstadt werden bis morgen Abend noch einmal rund 150.000 Menschen die Gelegenheit nutzen, sich von ihrem Präsidenten zu verabschieden.
Ronald Reagan, aufgebahrt in der Rotunde des Kapitols in Washington. Am Samstag war er mit 93 Jahren gestorben. Nancy Reagan an der Seite von US-Vizepräsident Dick Cheney. 50 Jahre war sie mit Ronald verheiratet. Jetzt hat sie der Tod geschieden. Wir wussten, dieser Moment würde kommen, aber das macht es nicht einfacher. Unter den Trauernden noch Margaret Thatcher, die frühere britische Premierministerin. Weitere ranghohe Gäste werden morgen zum Staatsakt erwartet, auch Kanzler Schröder. Nancy Reagan, gestern war sie mit der Präsidentenmaschine auf der Andrews Airbase bei Washington gelandet. Mit an Bord die sterblichen Überreste ihres Mannes. Hail of the Chief, das Lied der amerikanischen Präsidenten zur Begrüßung. Dazu 21 Salutschüsse. Der Weg zum Kapitol ein feierlicher Trauerzug. 6 Pferde ziehen eine Lafette, darauf der Sarg mit einer US-Flagge bedeckt. Dahinter ein Pferd ohne Reiter. Reagans Reitstiefel stecken verkehrt herum in den Steigbügeln. Eine alte Tradition als Ehre für den früheren Oberbefehlshaber der Streitkräfte. Tausende säumen die Straßen. Amerika nimmt Abschied von seinem 40. Präsidenten. Soldaten tragen den Sarg hinauf zum Kapitol. Nancy Reagan bleibt an seiner Seite. Die Rotunde im Kapitol. Bis zur Trauerfeier am Freitag bleibt der Sarg dort aufgebahrt. Dann wird Ronald Reagan in Kalifornien beigesetzt, bei Sonnenuntergang.
Reagan war vor 5 Tagen im Alter von 93 Jahren gestorben und wird morgen mit einem Staatsbegräbnis beigesetzt. Aus den USA berichtet Volker Albers.
Dass die Amerikaner Ronald Reagan verehren, war bekannt. Aber diese Dimension der Anteilnahme hat dann doch niemand erwartet. Über 100.000 Menschen haben dem Ex-Präsidenten bereits die letzte Ehre erwiesen. Und so wird es bis morgen weitergehen. Es scheint so, als ob diese durch Irakkrieg, Folterskandal und andere Probleme zutiefst verunsicherte Nation sich ganz einfach zurücksehnt nach den scheinbar so guten alten Zeiten. Das ist meine Art, Danke zu sagen, meint dieser Mann, nicht für das, was er für mich getan hat, sondern für das, was er für unser Land getan hat. Ehrensalut für den 40. Präsidenten der USA. Vertreter aller Waffengattungen begleiten den Trauerzug. Ein alter Militärbrauch, das mitgeführte Pferd, in den Steigbügeln stecken verkehrt herum Reagans Reiterstiefel. Ronald Reagan war mehr als eine historische Figur. Er war ein glücklicher Mann, der da war, als unser Land und die Welt ihn brauchten. Schwere Tage für Nancy Reagan. Ihre Beziehung zu dem Verstorbenen gilt als eine der großen Love Stories dieses Landes. Erst morgen Abend, wenn Reagan in Kalifornien die letzte Ruhe findet, kann sich die Witwe wieder aus der Öffentlichkeit zurückziehen und privat um ihren Mann trauern.
Thousands of mourners pay their respects to President Reagan, filing past his flag-draped casket in the nation's capital. Secretary of State Colin Powell remembers the president he served as a soldier and as chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And then Tim Russet of Meet the Press on President Reagan's life and legacy and more. All next on Larry King Live. We begin tonight checking in at the State Department in Washington, D.C. with Secretary of State Colin Powell as we discuss the passing of his friend, the former President Ronald Reagan. How, Mr. Secretary, did you learn of his death?
My staff advised me of it last Saturday night when we were in Paris, and I had known for several days that he was failing rapidly, so it wasn't unexpected, but nevertheless it was a shock when I heard it. As you said earlier, Larry, he was a dear friend of mine as well as my boss, as well as our president.
Did you see him at all during his last years?
No, I saw him about 8 or 9 years ago, before his famous letter, and right after I retired. And I knew then that he was starting to slip. He had not yet written his letter, but it was clear he was having more difficulty with speech and with connecting with people. And so I knew that he was an ill man then. And I stayed in very close touch with Mrs. Reagan over the years, and I was able to speak to her Sunday on my way back from the beaches at Normandy.
You know, she is an enormous, for want of a better term, fan of yours.
I'm pleased to hear that, Larry. I think highly of her. She is a dear friend, and we not only became friendly during the 2 years that I worked for President Reagan, but after he left office, we became much closer, and I treasure that friendship, and I think the world of her.
How did you get to be his national security advisor?
I was brought back to work in the National Security Council in January of 1987 after the Iran-Contra problem broke out. Frank Carlucci was selected to be the National Security Advisor. I'd worked for Frank I was a Corps commander in Germany at the time, and Frank asked me to come back and work as his deputy. And then President Reagan called and asked me to do it, and so I did it. Gave up my Corps command, came back, was Deputy National Security Advisor for about 10 months, and then Frank Carlucci left to go be Secretary of Defense, replacing Cap Weinberger, who did a brilliant job, and I replaced Frank Carlucci as National Security Advisor. I had gotten to know President Reagan rather well by then, and one day Frank just came into the Situation Room during a meeting and said on a little note, "You are now the National Security Advisor." And that's the way it unfolded. He left and I took over.
What was he like to work for or with?
A pleasure. A man of straightforward, simple, but clearly understandable principles that he never wavered from. He believed in the strength of our nation. He believed in the strength of our value system. He believed in the armed forces of the United States as the guarantor of our strength and as a way of demonstrating to the rest of the world that we will be strong and we will defend our interests, but you really ought to work with us to see if we can find mutual interest that both of us can work on. And that's what he did with the Soviet Union, and that's what he did in the last couple of years of his administration when Gorbachev came into power, the last 4 years. And he found somebody he could work with, and he didn't try to defeat Gorbachev or defeat the Soviet Union. He knew that was possible, but that wasn't his goal. His goal was to persuade Gorbachev and persuade the Soviet people that there was a better world, a better life waiting for them if they would abandon the policies that had brought them many, many guns, but very little butter.
Are you surprised at all at the outpouring all this week?
No, I'm delighted to see it all. I think all Americans look at Reagan and that sunny smile, that picture that we see in all of our news magazines, and his denim shirt with that hat on and that terrific smile coming at us. And that's the way we remember him, a man of incredible optimism, a man who knew who he was. Ronald Reagan knew who he was. There was never any confusion, never searching. And it was that coherence and that consistency of point of view and purpose, and that guy who always knew there was that shining city on the hill waiting everybody, that America saw and believed in. And now, many years after he left office, he continues to touch every American deeply. And you see that in this outpouring of affection for him and for Mrs. Reagan.
On Sunday night, we're going to repeat the interview I did with him after he had left office. In fact, a couple of months before, he gave you his own Reagan Medal of Freedom.
Yes.
He said he couldn't remember ever being angry. Maybe once he threw down his glasses on the table. Is that the way? Did you ever see him angry?
The most I ever saw him do was maybe say shucks over some particular problem that had occurred during that day, or some story in the newspaper that troubled him. But no, he tended not to be angry. He tended always to be on an even keel, which is what made it easy to work around him, to give him bad news or to tell him good news, but to know that this was an individual who was secure in who he was and kept that even keel going. And he always had that sense of humor bubbling. We all know that sense of humor. The American people know it, but those of us who worked for him saw it every day. He could always diffuse the most tense situation with one of his famous stories, and he had them all cataloged, and we came to know the stories so well. And in later years, it became a little more difficult for him to remember the stories through the punchline, and we'd help him with those stories. This is after he left office, of course. The last time I saw him, he was having some difficulty with the stories, but his desire to be warm with us, his desire to share humor with us, never left him, even though he had more difficulty going through the stories.
I understand you have a story about visiting him in California shortly after he left office involving a soldier's salute.
It's a favorite story of mine, Larry, but after he retired and went back to California, and then I retired several years later, and I was out in California, and I had some time, and I called Mrs. Reagan to see if I could come drop by and see them, and they said, sure, come on up to the house. And the local Army recruiter had been selected to be my chauffeur, a bit of a courtesy for an old retired four-star general. And as we were driving through Beverly Hills up to the house, this young sergeant gripping the wheel, probably a very important mission for him, said, please tell President Reagan for me how much all of us in uniform love what he did for us. He made us proud again. He made us so proud again. So we pulled up to the house, parked about 20 feet from the house. I got out, I rang the doorbell. President Reagan answered the doorbell, and I said, "Sir, there's a young soldier out here who wants to tell you something." And I motioned to the sergeant to come over to the door. And I thought he'd never let go of the steering wheel. He was gripping it so tight. But he let go of the steering wheel, got out of the car, came over to the president, and his eyes were wide open. And he didn't know exactly what to do, so he fell back in his training, came to attention, saluted President Reagan. President Reagan returned the salute in that manner that we all loved, and he used to tell us how he learned that. Pick it up and throw it away, the way he learned it in the Army. And so he returned that salute smartly. The young sergeant and the president exchanged a few words with each other, and the sergeant went back to the car. The president then invited me in. As we were walking in down the hallway to join Mrs. Reagan, he turns to me and he says, "Colin, is it okay if I still keep saluting?" And I said, "Mr. President, don't you ever stop. Don't you ever stop."
Wow. Did you learn a lot from him? Can you apply things you learned from him?
Yes, I learned to try to be calm in the midst of a storm. Sometimes I'm good at it, sometimes I'm not. I've learned to use humor more effectively. I learned that one ought to try to have a clear idea of where you're wanting to go and to try to get that down throughout your entire organization so that people can use you as their guide as you are guiding on your principles. And I learned to just realize that there's always another day coming that will challenge you and give you new opportunities and give you new problems that you have to deal with.
We are told that one member of the cabinet will not attend the service tomorrow morning so that in case of a, God forbid, catastrophe, some administration person is there. Do you know who that is, and will you be there?
No, I don't know who that is. We always have one person that is kept out from the rest of the cabinet members as a precaution. That's the pattern at our annual State of the Union speech. I don't know who it is, and right now no one's told me so that I am it, so I expect to be there.
You would certainly want to be there, right?
Very much. Alma and I are looking forward to being there and being in the presence of Nancy, of course, and the family, but in the presence of someone who will always be with us in spirit, if not in person.
Thanks, Mr. Secretary. Always good spending time with you.
Thank you, Larry.
Secretary of State Colin Powell. Tim Russert will be with us right after the break, and then later a special musical close tonight I know you're going to want to hear. Tomorrow night we'll anchor the proceedings from the spot of the burial up in Simi Valley in California, about an hour from where we speak. We'll be anchoring that for 90 minutes tomorrow night starting at 9 Eastern. Right back with Tim Russert right after this. We now welcome to Larry King live from our studios in Washington, Tim Russert, moderator of NBC's Meet the Press, senior vice president of Washington bureau chief for NBC News, and author of a terrific new book and a New York Times bestseller. He was on to discuss that book a little while ago. I got to read the book right after that. There you see its cover, Big Russ and Me, Father and Son, Lessons of Life, and a great Father's Day gift. Congratulations, Tim, a great book.
Thanks a lot, Larry.
We asked General Powell this. I'll ask you, are you surprised at the outpouring?
I'm not. You know, it's quite interesting growing up the way I did in an Irish Catholic neighborhood. And in my book, I write about my dad's innate optimism. And it was the kind of optimism that I think Ronald Reagan shared with the country as president. And then that coupled with the way he died, dying in dignity by openly telling the American people of his affliction with Alzheimer's and telling him that he was now prepared to travel into the final sunset of his life. I think those two notions of optimism and candor really underscore the outpouring of affection we're seeing over the last week.
And with Nancy's coming out strongly for stem cell research in the embryonic area, do you think that might help that along?
Oh, absolutely. To conversations I've had with Republicans this week, they are looking to her as a very active spokesperson on that issue. And in the end, it is going to be Republicans who are going to have to cross over and join with Democrats in a bipartisan way if the laws are ever going to be changed on that particular subject.
What, Tim, did he represent, do you think, that touched so many people, even so many people who disagreed with him politically?
I think that's a very important point, Larry. You know, in my lifetime, there only have been 2 presidents who I remember coming forward and acknowledging a mistake, a big mistake. John Kennedy on the Bay of Pigs and Ronald Reagan on Iran-Contra. And both of them, I think, enhanced their credibility and popularity by doing just that. Secondly, there was this notion of Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill, who really had 2 deeply different philosophies and ideologies. And yet they both insisted that at 6 p.m., the fighting stop and people be willing to try to share a drink or a joke and find some common ground. The American people sense that immediately. They know when someone's a good guy, a nice guy. And even though they may disagree with policies or ideology or philosophy, as my dad would say to me, that if someone likes you, they'll give you the benefit of the doubt.
Is that not around now?
It's poisonous, Larry, in Washington. People line up as either Democrats or Republicans. There's very little interaction, socialization between the parties. I used to watch Barry Goldwater and Hubert Humphrey debate each other on the Senate floor and then go off into the cloakroom and have a drink together. That's sorely missing. And I think that if there's anything that perhaps America has learned over this last week is that you can have a politics that is deeply passionate, deeply issue-driven, one where people can be very policy and conscious and devoted to principle, and still agree or disagree in a way that is compatible with that view and compatible with civility.
How about tomorrow? What are you looking forward to?
I think the gathering itself is going to be extraordinary. In one house, you will have the presidents, the former president, the leaders of Congress of both parties, the Supreme Court, the delegation from around the world, former Prime Minister Thatcher, Prime Minister Blair, Prince Charles, representatives of the G8 countries, the industrialized democracies. I think the route through Washington, a final farewell, will be extraordinary. And then going out to where you are, and you talked about the sunset burial, kind of fitting in his native state of California.
And I'll be anchoring that tomorrow night. And when we come back, we're going to ask Tim about the extraordinary relationship of Reagan and Gorbachev. Our guest is Tim Russert. His book, Big Russ and Me, a major bestseller, and deservedly so. We'll be right back. Lines continue in the nation's capital. Our guest is Tim Russert of Meet the Press and the author of Big Russ and Me, a major, as we said, bestseller. How do you explain that relationship? He visited, he was in the Rotunda today. He'll be at the funeral tomorrow. How do you explain that Gorbachev relationship with Reagan?
I think it goes back to the fundamentals, Larry, and that was that Gorbachev was trying to take Ronald Reagan's measure when they first met. And he understood that he had been able to negotiate with a whole variety of people in his political life. This is Mr. Gorbachev. And then he met someone named Ronald Reagan who basically said, if we have to spend you into submission from a defense standpoint, we can do that. Or we can come to terms here. And sometimes Ronald Reagan would ratchet up the rhetoric with the now infamous tear down this wall, Mr. Gorbachev. So Gorbachev never had a chance to question whether President Reagan was serious about winning the arms race through increasing defense spending. And I really do believe in the end that Gorbachev calculated that the Soviet Union could not compete with the United States in terms of defense spending, Larry, and still take care of their people. And it was the equivalent of a technical knockout. Gorbachev, when he opted for perestroika and glasnost, you saw the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union as we knew it then.
But also it turned into a pretty good, according to Nancy, friendship. They genuinely liked each other.
I think it's two men who understood who they were, where they came from. Both had a pretty good sense of humor. I remember when we went over to Moscow, Tom Brokaw was going to interview Mikhail Gorbachev, and I had a poster of then the 12 people running for President of the United States who were having a debate at the Kennedy Center. And I said, Mr. Gorbachev, who do you think your opponent will be? And he took out a pen, and his staff was going crazy, and he quickly circled all 12 and yelled in English, one of them. So he was someone who understood that. You know, Larry, I think every time I see a picture of Ronald Reagan in Berlin tear down that wall, I remember back as a little boy, Nikita Khrushchev banging his shoe at the United Nations saying, one day your children will grow up in communism, and my dad saying, no sir, no sirree, you got it wrong. And now 3 years ago, Sergei Khrushchev, Nikita Khrushchev's son, became an American citizen. That is what the American dream is all about. That's what standing up and winning the Cold War is all about.
And speaking of that, did Ronald Reagan's formidability on the world stage surprise you?
I didn't know him well, other than he was the governor of California. What I did know in 1980 was that the Jimmy Carter campaign, then seeking re-election, was welcoming the prospect of running against Ronald Reagan. They couldn't believe their good fortune that he was going to be the nominee of the Republican Party, because they thought they could portray him as someone who was very far right and inexperienced on foreign policy. And they obviously learned, as did the American people, that he was a very formidable candidate. Larry, he ran for election 4 times, twice as governor, twice as president, and won 4 landslides. There's a lesson there. And we call him the great communicator, but the way he communicated was in a very simple, direct, and understandable way. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And so I think when he went and sat down with world leaders, they didn't get a lot of nuance and complexity, but they got a very straightforward and cogent presentation of his deeply held philosophy, and I think they found that somewhat refreshing.
During his term in office, you worked for 2 very prominent Democrats, Pat Moynihan in the Senate, Mario Cuomo in the governor's office. What did they think of him?
Well, Daniel Patrick Moynihan is a very interesting example. He worked for, as you know, 4 presidents, 2 Republicans, Nixon and Ford, 2 Democrats, Kennedy and Johnson. In fact, it was Pat Moynihan that gave the gridiron address the Saturday night before the President Reagan was shot. And President Reagan responded to it, and they had a wonderful but civil exchange that great evening. And the most important thing I think that developed then was a respect for each other and their views, which led to, 2 years later, Bob Dole and Pat Moynihan going to see President Reagan and saying, we have a problem with Social Security. Unless we do something now, it's going to go insolvent. They brought in Alan Greenspan, went to see the president, and he said, where does Tip O'Neill stand on this? And they were able to hammer out a compromise. Ronald Reagan, Tip O'Neill, Pat Moynihan, and Bob Dole, which saved Social Security. You can't do much better than that. Mario Cuomo.
Yeah, I was going to say, the Democrats had only one great moment in 1984, and that was Cuomo's speech in San Francisco. And you and I stood together and watched that speech because he went on my radio show right after it. What did you think of Ronald Reagan?
Well, he was obviously, I think, deeply impressed by his ability to communicate. And that's why when Cuomo responded with the keynote address at the '84 convention, it was to the shining city on the hill, because he realized how well President Reagan had done with that theme. And so what Governor Cuomo said is, Mr. President, there are 2 cities, one shining city on the hill and another city that still needs help, which was the Democratic philosophy, the Democratic theme. But the most funny thing I heard in this whole exchange, Larry, is that night on the radio, you asked Mario Cuomo, what did he think of Ronald Reagan? He said, Larry, look at his hair. How can you not like him?
You remember that? Hey, that's right. That's only 20 years ago. Tim Russert is our guest. When we come back, we'll have him to play historian and tell us how history is going to rate President Reagan. His book, Big Russ and Me, Father and Son, Lessons of Life, a wonderful read. Be right back.
We met as we had to meet. I called for a fresh start, and we made that start. I can't claim that we had a meeting of the minds on such fundamentals as ideology or national purpose, but we understand each other better, and that's a key to peace. I gained a better perspective. I feel he did too. I told him we don't make those kinds of deals in the United States. We prefer no agreement than to bring home a bad agreement. The maxim is, doviai no proviai. Trust but verify.
Но значение этого...
На каждой встрече вы это повторяете.
You repeat that at every meeting.
I want you to know we think of you as friends. And in that spirit, we would ask one further favor of you. Tell the people of the Soviet Union of the deep feelings of friendship felt by us and by the people of our country toward them.
This is CNN.
Before we touch some other bases with Tim Russert, don't forget his book, Big Russ and Me, Father and Son, Lessons of Life. We'll get to other subjects, ask about your father's reaction to all the success of this, but on Reagan, what will history say of Ronald Reagan?
I think we're seeing it begin to take form this week, Larry, as people reflect back on Ronald Reagan. Clearly, at the end of the Cold War, he will be given enormous credit for. I believe that in terms of sustained economic growth, he'll get credit for. On the downs ledger, if you will, there will be some historians who will take note of the large deficits that were created, and will be a robust, I think, historical debate about the idea of supply-side economics. Also, I think Iran-Contra will be talked about, which was a very, very serious issue, as you remember, Larry, taking arms and sending them to Iran, and then the money that was gotten from those sales diverted to the Contras in Nicaragua. People probably forget now, but some were even suggesting a potential impeachment. But it was late enough in the president's second term that that never actually took form. And the president, to his credit, stepped forward and said, I didn't know it was happening, and to this day I don't want to believe it was, but the facts speak otherwise, and it should not have been done, which I think is very, very essential. But overall, Larry, I think that there will be a sense that he was a very strong president, a very strong leader, and that there were many people who will come forward, I think, and attest to that from both political perspectives. But I think the record must be complete. I think the record must be complete. There will be discussion of Iran-Contra, discussing of supply side, and I think there will also be talk about the disenfranchisement of Americans who felt that they did not participate in the economic growth. One other political point, the Republicans achieved control of the United States Congress for the first time in 70 years, of both houses, under Ronald Reagan.
Will this death affect this political race?
I think it already has. Going into last weekend, we were going to have covered the resignation of George Tenet at the CIA. We would be focusing much on Iraq all this week. Instead, the coverage has been almost exclusively Ronald Reagan, what is largely considered a successful conservative Republican president. The Bush-Cheney re-election website has been redesigned to have a tribute to Ronald Reagan. John Kerry has suspended most of his political activity. So what had the potential, and that's how you look at these presidential campaigns week by week, what had the potential of being not a particularly good week for President Bush is now a week filled with a positive discussion generally of the conservative Republican president, and obviously the incumbent hopes some of that rubs off on him.
But still, it's only June, and you know it changes quickly, doesn't it?
Oh, does it ever. And the one thing we've learned about incumbents running for re-election, Larry, is that in the end, those races are generally not close. Eisenhower, Nixon, Reagan, Clinton, all won re-election by big margins. Jimmy Carter, former President Bush, were not re-elected by pretty sizable margins.
How's your father reacting to the success of the book, to his newfound fame?
He can't believe it. He keeps saying to me, and I can't believe people are buying a book with my picture on it. He came down Saturday with my sisters and my mom for my son's high school graduation. And we took him to the World War II memorial. And he loved it. He went right over to the New York section, where obviously the state he's from. And people were coming up to him, "Hey, Big Russ, hey, Big Russ." There's something he's not used to. But he gave it the thumbs up signs, and he was kind of enjoying the whole spectacle. You know, I told you, Larry, one of the chapters in the book is on food. There's one on respect, one on his military service. And the food, his quote is, "You got to eat." He'll call you in the morning on your birthday and say, "Happy birthday, what are you having for dinner?" And I'll say, "Dad, it's 7 o'clock in the morning. You know, can I get through breakfast first?" "No, you got to eat. You got to eat." So he was asked in one of the interviews where that phrase came from, and he said, "Well, the kid got it wrong." And my heart stopped. I said, "How could I have gotten it wrong?" He said, "That's all you ever say, Dad, you got to eat." He said, "I got it from Dr. Mattie Burke." And what Mattie Burke really said is, "You got to eat if you're going to drink."
Did he like the memorial, though, huh? There is some controversy over that memorial.
He loved it. He loved it. The fountains, the stars, he felt at home. It was deeply emotional for him, but there were other veterans there, and I don't think Dad pays much attention to the architectural reviews. What he knew is that there was a statement being made by the American people that thanked him and millions of others for coming together and saving the world from Adolf Hitler.
Let's take a call for Tim Russett, Rochester, Minnesota. Hello.
Hi. I'm so glad to be able to speak with you. I went to some meetings in Washington, D.C. recently, and we went to the Ronald Reagan building, the Ronald Reagan Federal Building. And, you know, we have the airport named after him and everything. Do you think there needs to be more stuff named after him?
Well, there's certainly discussion in Congress. Some Republicans are suggesting that Ronald Reagan's picture replace Alexander Hamilton on a $10 bill. But, you know, the two examples the caller just gave, I think, are a pretty interesting metaphor for Ronald Reagan. And that is, the national airport is named after him, and yet he's the same president who fired the air traffic controllers. And the Ronald Reagan building is probably one of the biggest government buildings in Washington, and yet Ronald Reagan ran against big government. But he was someone who was able to preach his gospel and yet have people who underestimate him and also willing to compromise with them, Larry. You know, the first Reagan tax cut was very significant, very large, and 2 years later, when the deficit began to grow, President Reagan agreed to what then was called a mid-course correction, which in effect raised taxes. But he never preached that. He always went forward with his philosophy, but then was a very pragmatic politician in order to maintain some kind of common ground with the Democratic opposition.
Speaking of the Democratic opposition, when do you expect a vice presidential nominee?
Well, it's interesting. You know, there had been talk it would come as early as May. Well, May has come and gone. I think it's going to be much closer to the convention, which is still about 7 weeks away. We continue to follow this. We know the people who are being vetted, as we say, the background checks, if you will. Senator John Edwards of North Carolina, Congressman Gebhardt of Missouri, Governor Vilsack of Iowa, Governor Richardson of New Mexico. It's interesting as to how John Kerry is approaching this very methodically, but ultimately the choice, I think, will be very revealing. If he opts to choose Dick Gebhardt, someone who's steady, someone who can help him in Missouri and perhaps some of the battleground states, it'll be seen as a cautious choice, a predictable choice. John Kerry likes Dick Gebhardt. It's someone he thinks he could govern with. If he opts for John Edwards, someone who probably can't bring his home state of North Carolina, but someone who's extremely articulate, are able to force an argument in an interesting way with Vice President Cheney or with criticism of President Bush. And yet John Kerry doesn't know Senator Edwards as well as he knows Congressman Gebhardt. And they really, had a few punches back and forth, in the campaign. A little bit bolder choice, if you will. But I still think we're several weeks away.
With a possible long shot, Dick Cheney was a long shot.
He sure was. He was the man in charge of the search committee, and he wound up being on the ticket. I don't see that. I could be fooled, could be surprised. I was surprised by Joe Lieberman when Al Gore picked Joe Lieberman back in 2000. But I think it's always very revealing of a presidential candidate. Remember Ronald Reagan in 1980, Larry, in the hall in Detroit, when there were negotiations going on between Ronald Reagan and Jerry Ford, the former president, and whether Jerry Ford would join Reagan on the ticket as vice president and maybe share the presidency. Ronald Reagan instinctively sensed it wasn't going to work, got in the car, drove to the hall, and announced George Bush because he realized he had to step on the Ford story and put forward his person and show decisiveness.
Jerry Ford discussed that with us on Tuesday night. We'll come back with some more moments with Tim Russert, the author of Big Russ and Me, Father and Son, Lessons of Life. Don't go away. Watching this earlier tonight, President Bush and Laura Bush visiting the Rotunda, pay their respects. The president will speak tomorrow at the national service at the cathedral. Programming starts on CNN at 10 a.m. Eastern Time tomorrow morning. The president and Mrs. Bush would later meet with Nancy Reagan. There you see that picture. Nancy is staying at the Blair House right across the street. We're with Tim Russert, author of Big Russ and Me, Father and Son, Lessons of Life. Middletown, Connecticut, hello.
Hello. For 4 months, President Carter was unsuccessful in negotiating a hostage release with Iran, and it probably cost him the election. Yet on the same day President Reagan took office, Iran released the hostages, and the weapons embargo against Iran was lifted. I've always wondered, how did President Reagan accomplish in just 1 day of office what Carter couldn't achieve in 4 months?
I think that was largely the Iranian decision, Larry. President-elect Reagan did not have a negotiating team. Those people who are active supporters of President Reagan will say the Iranians did it because they knew Ronald Reagan was coming to office and they were afraid of paying any consequences. But it's largely seen by historians as the Iranians trying to give a final insult to President Carter.
Another important world leader, Lech Walesa, visited the Rotunda today. He played a big story in the end of communism, did he not?
Oh, Larry, when you think about that, here is Lech Walesa, a carpenter, a son of a carpenter, who traded in his skills to rid Poland of communism. Huge. Also, Pope John Paul II. It was something that a key role he played in ending the Cold War. If you just think back, it seems so ancient, but we were engaged in this titanic struggle as to who would win. Whether it would be communism or capitalism, whether it would be democracy or totalitarianism. And it came to an end just about 20 short years ago.
He'll be with us on June 24th. He will share the bestseller list with you shortly. How big do you expect Clinton's book to be?
I think it'll be big. The advanced publication is 1.5 million. I think there's an enormous curiosity about William Jefferson Clinton. And in 900 pages, no matter how hard he may try to avoid some controversy, he is going to stir up controversy. Wherever he goes, he seems to bring it, Larry. And it's going to be fascinating to me to see the reaction of the Kerry campaign, because suddenly on June 22nd, This book is going to explode, and I think be debated and argued about on talk radio and cable television and everywhere else, probably for several weeks leading up to the Democratic convention.
But in all his appearances, he'll be plugging Kerry, too, so there's a plus and a minus for the senator, is there not?
There is, in terms of the Democratic base. But we have an election now that we're approaching where in these 50 states that we live in this great country, 32 have made up their mind. There are only 18 undecided states remaining. And in those states, it's 45 Kerry, 45 Bush, with 10% undecided. And how do you persuade those 10% undecided voters? Al Gore clearly made a calculation in 2000. He didn't think his association with Bill Clinton would help him with those undecided voters. Can Bill Clinton generate turnout? Absolutely, particularly with minority voters. And that's an important point tonight, Larry, in our discussion here. You know, it's Ronald Reagan is perceived as this enormous giant, an icon, which he is. And yet there are many Americans, particularly African-American voters, who did not feel those same views towards Ronald Reagan. And if you trace the African-American vote for the Republican candidate for president, it has been on a steady decline. And in 2000 election, only 8% of African Americans voted for Republican George W. Bush. That has to be of concern to all Republicans as we talk about the upcoming election in 2004.
Do you expect him to do better with that number?
I think it's pretty tough. And Matthew Dowd, a very smart man who's the President Bush's chief strategist, wrote a memo 2 years ago where he said to President Bush, "You lost the popular vote in 2000 by 500,000 votes. If women, blacks, and Hispanics vote in the same percentage in 2004, because of changing demographics, there are more of them, you'll lose the popular vote by 3 million. That's why President Bush has had a very deliberate attempt to reach out to the Hispanic community particularly, and by framing his political views as compassionate conservatism, hoping to recruit women, blacks, and Hispanics to the Republican camp.
One other thing, we got about a minute and a half left. What do you expect of June 30th and the turnover?
Well, obviously, everyone hopes it goes smoothly. It appears that the new prime minister, the new president of Iraq, are trying to take control. But in the end, Larry, the Iraqis have to decide to secure their own new government. And that means having to kill fellow Iraqis who are insurgents or resistors or terrorists, whatever label you want to apply to them. If they are not willing to spill their own blood to help create a new democracy or some form of self-government, then it's not going to work. Everyone I talk to at every level believes it has a potential of being an extremely bloody summer.
Quickly, who's on Meet the Press Sunday?
Colin Powell, the man who just was with you, plus the new president of Iraq and President Karzai of Afghanistan. A very interesting show with a lot of people, a lot of guests we don't normally see on American television. And I look forward to being there.
Yeah, but other than that, who you got? Thanks, Tim, as always.
I hope Chance gives you a copy of Big Russ and Me for Father's Day, Larry.
Hey, never. Cannon, too, they'll both be there.
All right.
Thanks, Tim. Tim Russett, the book is Big Russ and Me, Father and Son, Lessons of Life. And as I said, I've read it just in the last week. It is a terrific book. And we have a very special segment coming up on this edition of Larry King Live, and it will follow these messages. We, my family and I, have a very personal relationship with Nancy Reagan. And so we thought, and I asked the staff to put together a composite. And I asked and had the family select a special piece of music to close out this program. Watch.
In this room lives the sweet ghost of a love gone away. It comes to me whispering, things you used to say, between hills and valleys of softness where we lay in this room. It's lonely now. In this room I can barely breathe. This air that speaks your name, it flows through me from each corner and from the window frame where we'd watch together for the sun to rise again. In this room I miss you.
So Nancy, let me say thank you for all you do. Thank you for your love. And thank you for just being you.
They say true love never dies, but sometimes lovers do. And few ever realize the kind of love we knew. In this room there were flowers sent to ease the pain, and I prayed for hours, trying to understand how one life passing could mean this love was through. In this room I can feel you, I will see you again. In this room.
Kapitol von Washington hat US-Präsident Bush mit seiner Frau Laura Abschied vom früheren Staatsoberhaupt Reagan genommen. Auch der ehemalige Präsident der Sowjetunion Gorbatschow erwies seinem einstigen Kontrahenten die letzte Ehre. Gorbatschow und Bush werden beim Staatsakt für den Verstorbenen dabei sein, den das ZDF heute ab 16:15 Uhr live überträgt.
Even his critics liked him. When you compare him with the current president, George W. Bush, many liberals disliked Ronald Reagan, his policies, his philosophy, but they couldn't help but like the man. He had a great sense of humor, he was engaging. They really disliked George Bush and see nothing there to like or admire in his personality.
Huge difference between politics today and politics back then. I'm thinking about when Ronald Reagan, after Iran-Contra, said, "My heart tells me I did not swap arms for hostages, but my head and the evidence tells me otherwise." And when he said, Abdul Poindexter says the buck stops here, it doesn't. The buck stops with me. Very different, even to Bill Clinton.
That's right. He handled that crisis masterfully. He practiced the first principle of damage control, which is let the worst information out first. The very first day, he said, we sold arms to Iran. He dropped 20 points in the polls, and after a year of hearings, he never went any further down.
Why did others not learn that lesson? Why? I mean, was it innate to Ronald Reagan? He had an ability to do it. Why did Bill Clinton not learn that with the Lewinsky scandal? All these other people.
Because they all think they can manage an affair, manage a scandal better than anyone else. If I'm doing it, I can handle it better, and the worst information will never come out. It always does. But Ronald Reagan proved something else. In politics, you have to have a base. Your base are the people who are with you when you're wrong. In Iran-Contra, he was wrong. He acknowledged it. And there were millions of Americans who stood by him because he believed in them. That's crucial because sooner or later, every political leader is going to be wrong.
You covered the Reagan years. This is this morning's Herald Tribune newspaper. A great president, only time will tell. A great president?
He was an important president.
Oh,
that's all I will say.
The fence is wavering here, Bill.
Yeah, well, I agree with the Herald Tribune. I wouldn't reach the conclusion yet, it's too early, that he was a great president. He certainly was an important president. He changed the direction of American politics, and he built a coalition that is still in power 25 years later. How about that?
Another unfair question.
All right.
You're taking unfair questions, aren't you?
I am indeed.
The Americans will be angry and certainly unhappy that Jacques Chirac is not attending the funeral. Is it a mistake for the French president? Will it be seen by the United States, by many people in America, as a snub that he's not going?
Yes, it will. He says he has other engagements, but as you know, there are very delicate relations between the United States and France. There was some evidence that perhaps things were getting warmer this week and after D-Day, but the fact that he's not attending President Reagan's funeral, even though the president who is in power, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, will be there, and that's appropriate, the fact that Chirac is one of the world leaders at the G8 summit who will not attend the funeral, I think a lot of Americans, particularly Republicans, particularly Bush supporters, will take that as an affront.
Right, I want to very quickly, before we finish, talk about this election that we're in November. Where are the polls at the moment? Pretty neck and neck.
They are pretty neck and neck. If the election were held today, two things would happen. One, I believe John Kerry would win. Two, I believe millions of Americans would be astonished because the election is not being held for 5 months, and they're not thinking about it right now. Bush is in trouble right now.
But he's a fighter.
He is a fighter.
He's got a team that fights dirty in many ways, and he will fight hard.
He will fight hard. The economy is improving. There are any number of unforeseeable events that could happen between now and the election. The Attorney General talked about the possibility of another terrorist attack. I think that would cause Americans to support this president. Suppose they find Osama bin Laden, and they'd better find him dead, because if he's captured alive, the idea of trying to put him on trial before a United States War Crimes Tribunal is a nightmare. Fidel Castro could die any time. There are many things that could happen that could throw this election upside down.
But do you expect any of them to happen? I mean, I'm not asking you to say whether you expect anyone to die, God forbid. But I mean, do you expect that anything could happen?
I expect every minute of every day.
Bill Schneider, we are very pleased that you've taken time while you've been coming through it. Many thanks indeed.